But thank you all for joining us today for this workshop on transferring tapes and working with vendors to digitize AV materials wherever you may be coming from. I will there'll be a little caveat here just at the header, just that I'm aware that I'm here at the University of Florida with much of our DLOC team, and so a lot of my experiences and sort of the information that I can provide does come from a US focused approach, and so there's certainly going to be local conditions and local opportunities and perhaps also local barriers for sometimes working with vendors who may be based in the US or elsewhere, but hopefully we can get over that. It's, as you may be aware, my name is Fletcher Durant, and I am the Director of Conservation and Preservation at the University of Florida Libraries. In that role, I am responsible for many of our vended digitization projects, and I work closely with a fairly large number at this point of digitization vendors working on different materials. Hopefully I will be able to share some helpful information with you today and answer questions that you may have concerning projects at your own institutions. So, the start of this is always, why do we choose to digitize our audio and video holdings? And the answer is almost always that either we want to facilitate access to the materials or to preserve them. And really, usually the answer is both, access and preservation. As I'm sure many of you may know, audio and video materials, particularly tapes and magnetic media, are at high risk of loss and deterioration as they age. There are several reasons for this. The first is what we call format obsolescence, by which we mean that it gets harder and harder to find playback equipment for older formats. We can pretty easily get our hands on functioning DVD players. We can even still get VHS tape decks, but earlier formats such as U-matic tapes or 2-inch quad tapes are increasingly hard to find functional equipment for. And so you may have a tape in your collections, but if you don't have equipment to play it back, you're at a loss, really, and you've got a hidden collection on your hands. Secondly, but perhaps most importantly, most of these tape formats that we have in our collections are past their expected lifespan. The plastic substrates are aging and become increasingly prone to breaking. The binder layer, which you see here in the maroon on the side of the screen here, that's the layer that holds the magnetic recordings that makes them magnetic media. But this binder layer absorbs moisture over time and is prone to what we call sticky shed or hydrolysis, in which the binder layer swells and sort of weakens, and then when the tape runs through the playback equipment, that layer of data can get stripped off the plastic substrate of the tape, and so that can cause varying levels of loss from minor audio artifacts being recorded or left behind, or complete stripping of that layer and absolute loss. So it's really important that these documents from the late 20th century get transferred and preserved if we want them to be available for future generations. So today we are mostly talking about working with a vendor to outsource digitization. We're taking this approach mostly because the intricacies of doing the work in-house is probably a year-long course at least, and we only have an hour today. But really, for most institutions, unless you hold a very large quantity of AV materials, outsourcing is generally a more economical approach to digitization. It prevents you from having to worry about the headaches of acquiring equipment, maintaining that equipment, and having trained staff on hand to do the work. And really, looking for a digitization vendor is much like looking for any other vendor. You want to find someone who has the equipment and the capability and knowledge to do the work, is able to provide you with good references, trusted references, can offer you a budget that fits within your needs and what you are able to spend on a project, and ultimately also someone who you trust to do the work and be a good partner. And now, with that said, almost all vended projects start at more or less the same place, and that's the need to have intellectual control over your materials. And really, this is just an inventory. And so, and you may find if you start out by contacting vendors, they will likely provide you with a basic spreadsheet that has a limited number of metadata fields that they want to have you collect. But you can also, collect this list that I have here on the screen before you reach out to the vendors. And in some ways, that'll help you work with them more quickly get an actionable quote. But really, so no matter what your project, you need to create a basic inventory that has these 6 fields of data to really get an idea of what you have, what the cost will be, and how much how much time it may take. And I think there's probably nothing surprising on this list here. It starts with the fact that every item you plan to digitize needs to have a unique ID number, so that each piece of media can be identified as being different than another piece of media that you may send out. And generally, this a unique ID number would be written or tagged onto the physical media somewhere. And it travels with that tape or that reel, with that cassette, everywhere it goes. And each item also needs to have a file name so that when the item is digitized, it comes back and it's not just 1234.mp3 or 5678 .wave. You want the file name can be the same as a unique ID number that you provided. In many cases, that makes a lot of sense for connecting the digitized files to your holdings, but it could also be something more descriptive if that's an approach that you want to take at your institution. But also, generally, you want to provide a title, and that's a sort of generally a descriptive title. It may be speech, author, and a date, something like that. But really, it can be any sort of longer description that is helpful in having you identify the materials that you actually want to send out. If you can identify a date of the recording, and that's either the date that the recording originally took place or the date that the item, whether it's a tape or a reel, was created, that is helpful for vendors. You generally also are hoping to provide information on the length of the recording, but we'll talk a little bit more about estimating length later on. And finally, and really most importantly, you want to be able to identify what the format is. And so is this a VHS tape? Is it an audio cassette? Is it a 1/4-inch reel? Is it an 8mm film? Vendors can work around a number of these metadata fields. As I said, if you don't know what the date is, or if the tape is a mystery and no one knows what content is actually on there, maybe you don't need to provide a title. The vendor can really also help you identify formats, although we are going to spend time during this presentation going over some of the basics, and I'm going to offer you some resources, places where you can go online to help identify the formats in your collections. And again, as I said, the length of the recording can also be an estimate. Most VHS tapes are 2 hours. Most audio cassettes are 90 minutes. Sometimes they're 60 minutes. Sometimes they're 120 minutes. Oftentimes the tape, if it's a standard commercial tape, it will likely say the length of the recording on the object somewhere. And film and reels we can measure their size and estimate their length from that. So there are standards that you can be used, and you can always build in a little buffer so that the vendor can give you a high-end estimate of the cost, and that way you can plan out the budget that way. But really, having the format of the object and the length of the recording are really helpful in getting an accurate price estimate. So if you can get those two things down, you're in pretty good shape of knowing that you'll get a good estimate from vendors. Here we go. So it's a question of what you have. And for older archival collections, this can often be the trickiest question in any project, at least after you've identified a funding source for your project. And I will be talking about film here because I know that so many of us have mixed collections, and the process for working with vendors for film is often very similar. So if you have motion picture film, the first thing you want to be able to identify is what is the gauge. Do you have an 8mm film that was a home movie, or do you have a 35mm film for a feature-length film? Do you have a 120mm film from something that was, meant to be on the big screen? And really, for this, all you need is a ruler, and you can look at these images here on the screen, tell you what the various film types look like. But if you have a ruler with metric on it, you can just measure the film length, and you'll be able to tell pretty quickly, oh, this is 8mm, this is 9.5mm, which is more of a European format as opposed to a North American format, but 16mm, 35mm, these are all major things that you may easily expect to see in there. And then there's a question of, if you're looking at the 16mm, does it have 2 sprocket holes or 1 sprocket hole? And that's the difference between Super 16 and 16mm. And so that's a fairly straightforward measurement that you can take. The next question is, what is the length of the film or the size of the reel? And again, you just take your ruler and you measure. Is it a 3-inch reel? Is it a 7-inch reel? Is it a 10-inch reel? And generally, if it's a 10-inch reel, that should be about an 800 feet of film, unless it looks really, sometimes they put 200 feet on a 10-inch reel because that's all they had. So you can do some measurements, and you can measure the reel, but you can also measure the width of the diameter of the actual film itself on there to give you a sense, and you can discuss that with the vendor to get an estimate. The next question is, does your film have an audio track? Many films, modern film with sound has either an optical or a magnetic audio strip that's found by the sprocket holes on one side of the film. And the magnetic audio strip, it looks like what you would find on a cassette tape, where that's sort of that deep brown oxidized layer that's all one color and runs in a line down the side of the film. But it may likely be optical audio, which is generally much more commonly found. And that's what this image on the right looks like, that optical audio where you actually see the sound wave forms on the film. And again, this is just so you can let the vendor know that sound needs to be captured, or that it's unlikely that there's audio that goes with the film. Next, again, pretty easy to determine generally, is your film color or is it black and white? For that, look at the print, see if it's color, see if it's black and white. Next, is it a negative print or a positive print? And again, looking at this, does the sky look black, in which case you have a negative, or is it a positive, in which case the sky is a lighter color and the ground is usually a darker color? And then, importantly, especially if you're looking at older film, is trying to identify what the film base is. There's the history of film really comes in 3 parts. Early films were printed on cellulose nitrate, which is highly flammable, and it has special shipping requirements and is often very challenging to ship. And so, if it's nitrate, you may have more questions, and this is generally based on the date. There are some tests, and if you think you may have nitrate, I'd say contact me, and we can talk about how to identify that better. Generally, you find nitrate film on motion picture film before 1950. After 1950, and really after about the 1940s, most often you will have a cellulose acetate film base, in which case you will very likely be able to identify it from the odor of vinegar as that film base deteriorates. And then starting in about 1955, we really see polyester film bases take over. And polyester is much more stable. So there are fewer worries from a immediate preservation concern about digitizing it and shipping it. But if the film is anything except for polyester, I would expect there to be additional conversion and preservation costs from a vendor's estimate. Here are 3 links, and this is the very basics of identifying motion picture film. But these 3 links here will help provide more detail on what you may have as far as film. So again, and these links will be available after the presentation. Next, we're going to jump into audio identification. There's fewer details here, mostly because the picture, there's such a wide variety of formats and variations that I'm going to provide you with some more links and for websites to visit where you can really go drill down deeply. But again, as you know, it's like the core information vendors need to know are the formats and duration, but also whether the recordings are spoken word or music. Generally, musical recordings, take more skill and time to capture well, in part because the quality needs to be better. We're much more forgiving of audio recordings of just spoken word, or whether it's oral histories or speeches or public gatherings, just because those are generally much more informational rather than a musical performance in which we want to capture a wider range of dynamic sound. But usually, oral histories, I think, is mostly what we keep in in a lot of archival collections. But you may very well have vinyl records, 1/4-inch tapes, audio cassettes, even older formats like wax cylinders or wire recordings, and there are vendors that can do all those different kinds of work. The audio world is a flood with vendors that work on the more esoteric formats. And again, here are links to some of those websites that have really detailed information on how to identify the various audio formats you may have, especially vinyl media or other sorts of early formats. There's a big range. I know once we get to 1/4-inch reels and audio cassettes, the industrial world has standardized things pretty well, and as the markets stabilize. But there are a lot of minor formats from that come up from the 1890s through about 1950 or even 1960. And so if you have older collections, they may have very weird things in there, and that's fine, and in fact that's exciting, and you may find a vendor who's really excited to work on that. Video identification, again, very similar. Videotapes emerged in the late 50s and early 60s. There were a wide variety of them in the early days, but then they really became fairly standard. And first we see in this bottom right-hand corner, that's a 2-inch video tape. They also later came in 1-inch video reels, but then very quickly we get to see U-matic tapes, which was a commercial broadcast format from the 1970s and 80s and into the 90s. But most likely we have VHS tapes, Betamax tapes, mini DV cassettes from recordings in the 90s and early 2000s. But again, there are many different types of tapes that you may have. This is just a small sample, and websites like these have just a lot of detail about the various kinds of videotapes that were created and sold and what they were used for. And so I really encourage you, if again, if you have tapes that you want to identify, come back to this presentation, check out these links, and they'll be able to walk you through these websites step by step to identify what you have. So when it comes to talking with vendors, it's also helpful to identify some of the basic condition issues that you may have on the materials before you ship them out to them. And these, the more information that you can provide, the more accurate the pricing estimate will be, because generally, if your tapes have some sort of condition issue, there's an added cost, and it may just be that the vendor has to go, run the items more slowly through their capture equipment, or they may need additional cleaning or repair before they can even go through the equipment. So we talked about vinegar syndrome a little bit, which is cellulose acetate film deterioration. Over time, the plastic literally turns into vinegar and off gases, and so you will smell a very strong vinegar odor coming from these materials. And as that advances, the plastic becomes brittle and is very prone to breaking when it runs through machines. All plastics, as they age, often become brittle and are prone to breaking. They may already have broken, and so there may be repairs that need to be done to get the tapes prepped before they go through. Oftentimes, the physical cases, so the cassette of either the VHS cassette or the audio cassette, maybe broken. The sprockets in the middle may be broken. The plastic may be beaten up, and so sometimes those cases need to be replaced. Sticky shed syndrome, as I mentioned, for magnetic media, where the binder hydrolyzes and then often swells and can come off while playback is happening. That can be temporarily reversed by tape baking, which literally involves putting the tapes in an oven and baking them at a low temperature to dry them out, and that can be done by most qualified vendors, and it's a fairly minimal cost on an item per item basis. Other things you may see, there may be an uneven tape pack where the tape was rewound poorly or got jostled in storage. That can oftentimes just be a little extra handling to get the tape rewound so it plays smoothly through the system. And also, I think it shouldn't be surprising for those of us in the tropics and the subtropics. Oftentimes, sometimes I should say, we can find mold growing on our collections. Generally, magnetic media is not a great host for mold. There's not a lot there for the mold to consume. It's on film. It's more likely that there could be mold, as the gelatin layer provides a food source for the mold. You may sometimes see a white crystalline or powdery substance on a video reel or tape reel. It could be mold, but oftentimes that is actually a plasticizer, so a component of the plastic that makes the plastic bendable, aging and coming out of the plastic. And so it's not ideal if a plasticizer comes out, but it's certainly not as bad as mold, because those white crystals generally don't harm anything. So there is a big question, in the ideal world, we digitize everything in our collections and make them available online to patrons, whether that's through DLOC or other portals. But obviously the real world is always more complicated with, pesky things like budgets and staffing limits. So, how do we decide what to digitize? It's a great question, and every institution will have its own priorities. I generally like to consider a balance of preservation risk, and that's often the format that has is aging or has been damaged somehow, and balancing that with the perceived long-term research value, along with any current demand there may be for accessing the materials. And then, of course, cost comes into play as well. We may have 10,000 audio cassettes in our collection that we can get digitized for $25 each. And that would be great to do. But we may have one historic Edison wax cylinder from 1905 that we really want to have because it's a very unique and important item. And having that digitized may cost us $20,000. And so, which do you go with? The older item that is maybe of high research value, but you only get one of them, or this mass of materials that may have a variety of smaller research values associated with them? I don't have an answer to give you. Ultimately, there's a curatorial decision that should determine what to move forward with. I will say in general, it's pretty easy to approach AV collections and just say the simplest thing is just to digitize the oldest material first. The older the material is, the more likely it is to be in a vulnerable state. And so that's sort of the best way to approach it. But again, every institution, every organization is going to have its own ideas on how to do that. Again, once you figured out what you have and decided what to digitize, these resources, such as the Clear Recordings at Risk Program Technical Guidelines and the FAGI guidelines. The FAGI is the Federal Agency Digitization Guidelines Initiative. This is the US federal government's guidelines for digitizing federal collections. And they provide excellent language that you can give to vendors when discussing a digitization proposal to say, we want it done at this level of quality of work. Most US vendors will be able to tell you whether they are able to hit the FAGI standards. And that's almost always a good sign for a very high quality vendor. Of course, there are also often usually costs associated with that, higher costs associated with folks that have put in the time to hit the FAGI standards. But you can also pull out different language to work with folks that, just to let you know what outputs you may want. This here are the shortcut technical recommendations. If you have motion picture film, the preferred preservation format is DPX. At the moment, these do change over time. You can also use TIFF as a preservation output if you want. For video, AVI is the format at the moment that is understood to be the preferred preservation format. This is for video. This is changing a little bit as FFV1 Matroska are becoming more widely accepted. And again, these are things that will matter to any folks that are doing digital preservation or ingesting into digital repositories. But these formats, most vendors should be able to provide these without any issue. Audio, it's simpler generally. The broadcast wave format or the .wav is the preferred lossless file format for audio. And these are what we call the master preservation formats. These are the lossless, high-end, large size formats that we keep in our repositories to provide for the highest quality access or to create future copies off of. Generally, we also receive lower quality access versions of the files. And here at UF for video motion picture, we use MP4, and for audio files, we use AAC or MP3. And that's what's actually gets served up to patrons when they access things on the DLOC interface. And here's the big question. Ultimately, where do you find a trusted vendor? And really, this is my limitations here come into play, as I almost exclusively rely on US-based vendors. But for video and moving image digitization, I highly recommend looking at the Association of Moving Image Archivists Global Supplier Directory. This resource lists many companies around the world, and the listing highlights formats that each company is capable of digitizing. The list is generally composed of US, Canadian, and European companies. But I did note that Second Run Preservation, whose link is on the screen here, is a digitization company based out of Colombia that has experience working with archival materials. The folks there are graduates of the New York University Moving Image Archivist program, which I know those folks, I know a lot of them well, and a lot of their graduates, I know they generally do really good work. And so, for various folks around the Caribbean, working with a Colombian based company, it may be a helpful resource that can avoid sometimes some of the shipping headaches that come from sending materials to the US. Similarly for audio materials, the Association for Recorded Sound Collection, or ARSC, has their audio preservation and restoration directory that lists vendors with the formats that they work on. And again, the list is mostly US and European companies. And for many of the more widely held formats, you may very well be able to find local vendors who are able to digitize your materials. If you're talking about VHS tapes and audio cassettes, that's great. Supporting local local businesses is wonderful, and really will save you a lot of time and headaches on shipping and packing items. But you do want to ensure that those businesses are capable of digitizing the materials up to the standards and best practices outlined in the technical guidelines I shared a couple of slides ago. Just as a personal story, my father had an 8mm or Super 8 camera since he was a kid. So I grew up with a lot of home movies on film that we'd pull out and show on a screen around the Christmas tree every year. But then in the late 1980s, as VHS really became the format of choice, my parents decided to transfer all our 8mm movies onto VHS tapes. But when we got the VHS tapes back, the vendor hadn't accounted for the difference in the frame size between the 8mm film and the VHS tapes. And so the tops of everyone's heads and the bottoms of the film were all cut off of every frame. So it really made those videotapes pretty worthless. Luckily, we'd held on to the 8mm film and were later able to get them transferred onto DVDs, which was a much better process at that time. But that's not to say that local vendors who may work in the local film or music business can't and don't do good work. You may just want to send out samples beforehand to make sure that that what you get back meets the expectations that you want for the materials. If you are packing materials for shipment, you want to basically get a sturdy box, include generally an external hard drive, unless you're planning on using FTP or other internet-based delivery systems. The items should be packed snugly into the box with ample padding and bubble wrap or packing paper to prevent the items from shifting around in transit. At UF or in the US, we generally aim to ship materials early in the week and have them picked up by FedEx or UPS or DHL on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. We use a 2-day shipping option so that they get delivered on Thursday or Friday to the vendor. That way they don't have to sit anywhere in a warehouse over the weekend before getting delivered on the following Monday. I recognize that's not necessarily always an option for folks shipping materials from the Caribbean, but generally, the most direct shipment that you can get is the best, and it may very well be worth the time and cost to do priority shipping rather than a longer shipping time, just to make sure that boxes don't get caught in warehouses or customs for an extended period of time. When planning and budgeting for an AV project, you also want to consider adding in funding for some added costs. So when the vendor receives the items, it's very likely that if you're shipping out, 35-year-old VHS tapes or 50-year-old audio cassettes, that they're going to encounter some damaged or aging items. Oftentimes, some visible damage, such as broken tapes or damaged cases, can be identified before sending the tapes to the vendor, so you can build that in. But other times, things like sticky shed or the need for splices may not become known until the vendor attempts to digitize the item. Generally, I try and budget in about 10 to 15% above the digitization cost to cover these preservation steps by the vendors. And this is sort of based on our local experiences here at UF of digitizing audio cassettes from the 1960s and 70s, as well as VHS tapes from the 1980s. That's just sort of what I generally find to be the amount that we spend on things like tape baking and cleaning. But again, and if you have moldy collections, that may be a significant cost above digitization. Before planning any mass digitization, you also need to consider where you're going to store these files when you get them back, and to make sure that you have ample storage space to hold the newly digitized files. Up on the screen right now, you see basically what 1 hour of audio and 1 hour of video storage requirements are. For audio, it's 2 gigabytes of storage. That's not bad. If you have 10 cassette tapes that are 90 minutes each, it's you're talking about that's 15 hours of audio. That's 30 gigabytes of storage. That's probably not going to crash anything. But when you get to video, all of a sudden, an hour of video is 77 gigabytes of storage. So if you're thinking about sending out 100 videotapes, you're talking about terabytes worth of storage here. And also generally, the basics of digital preservation, which we're not talking about here, but oftentimes you're going to store these files in triplicate. And so, 77 gigabytes for an hour of video all of a sudden, becomes 225 gigabytes. And so all of a sudden, 4 hours of video is a terabyte of storage somewhere. And that's a big commitment for any organization. I know we've applied for to digitize a collection here in the state of Florida of video and audio, and it's going to be, it could be up to 80 terabytes of storage necessary. And that's a big conversation that we have to have with our both our budget, our fiscal services group, to make sure that we have the funds to pay for the storage, but also IT to make sure that we can actually build that into our systems to handle it. So storage when it comes to digitizing AV materials is something that needs to be thought of ahead of time. And DLOC, we love taking contributions from folks, from all our partners, but if we're planning on dropping in large amounts of AV materials, that has to be planned ahead of time. Finally, my final slide here, just sometimes folks do want to build out their own digitization labs. Here are some links. The NYU lab and the Stanford lab, they both list all the equipment that they have in their setups. So you can look at that and you can price that out and see if that's something that works for you. The bottom link there, Ashley Bluer is a digital archivist who has worked on setting up what she calls the minimum viable stations of sort of the minimum number of type of equipment that you may need to digitize audio and video. And her list they have a variety of things at different price points, include software as well. So folks can look at that if that's something you think makes sense for you. I don't want to go too much in there. As I said at the beginning, I often find it difficult to see archives recoup their costs unless you have large amounts of video, audio, or film that needs to be digitized in-house. And that is the end of my talk, my training. I hope it's been helpful.